What if one of the greatest wars ever told was not just a product of myth, but the echo of a real conflict that changed the ancient world forever? For centuries, people have debated whether Troy, the city immortalized in Homer's Iliad, was a place of stone, earth, and blood, or simply the backdrop of a legendary tale crafted to capture the essence of human struggle. From fiery ruins buried deep beneath the soil of modern-day Turkey to verses sung by poets more than 2,700 years ago, Troy stands at the intersection of history and myth, of fact and imagination. The story has everything: the abduction of Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, heroes like Achilles and Hector locked in mortal combat, and the cunning trick of the wooden horse that sealed the city's fate. These are the images etched into the Western imagination. But behind the poetry, behind the drama, lies a haunting question. Did any of this actually happen? You are about to step into that mystery. Together, we will trace the thread from Homer's immortal verses to the spades of archaeologists digging in Anatolian soil, from ancient maps and Hittite inscriptions to modern DNA and geological surveys. We will weigh the evidence, confront the skeptics, and ask ourselves, was Troy a real city laid low by war, or is it forever confined to the realm of myth? For most of us, Troy first comes alive in the lines of Homer's Iliad. This monumental poem, composed sometime in the 8th century BCE, is not merely a story. It is the foundation stone of Western literature. But what exactly does it tell us? At its heart, the Iliad is the tale of a brutal war, fought for love, honor, and vengeance. The spark, according to legend, was the abduction, or perhaps elopement, of Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, by the Trojan prince Paris. To reclaim her, the Greek world launched a massive campaign, uniting kings and warriors under the command of Agamemnon and laying siege to Troy. Within this saga march unforgettable figures. Achilles, the nearly invincible Greek warrior, whose rage drives much of the narrative. Hector, Troy's noble defender, torn between duty and fate. Odysseus, the cunning strategist, who later conceives the Trojan Horse. And hovering above them are the gods, pulling strings, intervening in battles, and ensuring that human affairs reflect divine rivalries. The Iliad is not a complete story of the Trojan War. It begins after nearly a decade of fighting and ends with Hector's funeral, long before the fall of the city. But it breathes life into the battlefield, describing walls that tower like mountains, warriors whose valor echoes through eternity, and a conflict so vast it seems destined to shape the fate of the world. For centuries, these verses were regarded less as history and more as cultural heritage, a mirror of Greek values, a meditation on glory and mortality, and an allegory of human conflict. Yet the central question has always lingered. Was Homer simply inventing a mythic stage for timeless themes, or was he preserving a memory, distorted through centuries of oral tradition, of an actual city and an actual war? This tension between myth and memory is what propelled countless scholars and adventurers to search for Troy in the real world. And in the 19th century, one man set out to prove that the city was more than just poetry. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. In the mid-19th century, a wealthy German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann became convinced that Homer's Iliad was more than a work of imagination. It was a map leading to a real city. At a time when many scholars dismissed the Trojan War as pure myth, Schliemann dared to take Homer literally. He believed the ruins of Troy lay hidden beneath a hill in northwestern Turkey, a mound known as Hisarlik. Schliemann was no ordinary archaeologist. In fact, he wasn't an archaeologist at all, but a treasure hunter driven by ambition and a love of Homer. In 1871, he began excavating Hisarlik with the determination of a man seeking to unearth a legend. And in the process, he made discoveries that electrified the world. One of his most dramatic claims was the unearthing of what he called Priam's treasure, a cache of gold, silver, and bronze artifacts that he declared once belonged to the Trojan king Priam himself. Photographs of his wife Sophia, adorned in the glittering jewelry, were published across Europe, fueling the belief that Schliemann had indeed found the fabled Troy. Yet behind the spectacle lurked serious problems. Schliemann's methods were reckless by modern standards. He dug massive trenches through the mound, destroying layers of ancient history in his rush to reach what he believed was the Homeric city. Later analysis revealed that the so-called treasure of Priam actually belonged to a much earlier settlement, centuries before Homer's time. Still, Schliemann's work was not in vain. Hisarlik proved to be no ordinary hill, but a site of multiple buried cities, stacked one atop another over thousands of years. Despite his flaws, Schliemann had drawn the world's attention to a place that could not be ignored. For the first time, the idea that Troy might be real moved from legend into the realm of archaeology. But if Troy truly lay buried at Hisarlik, which of those ancient cities was Homer's Troy? The answer would come with later discoveries, ones that painted a far more complex picture of Troy than Schliemann ever imagined. When archaeologists returned to Hisarlik after Schliemann, they realized something extraordinary. This was not the ruin of a single city, but of 9 successive cities, each built upon the rubble of the last. Over the centuries, layers of civilization had stacked up like the pages of a vast book, recording nearly 3,000 years of history. Among these layers, 2 stood out. Troy VI, a prosperous city of the late Bronze Age, around 1700 to 1250 BCE, boasted massive stone walls, watchtowers, and imposing gates. Its fortifications alone seemed to echo Homer's descriptions of lofty Ilios and its mighty defences. Yet Troy VI appeared to have been destroyed by an earthquake, not war. Then came Troy VII, built on the ruins of Troy VI. This city, dating roughly from 1250 to 1180 BCE, told a darker story. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of fire and destruction, human remains in houses, and weapons such as arrowheads scattered in the debris. Storage jars buried deep into the ground suggested a population preparing for siege, just as the Iliad describes. Unlike the natural ruin of Troy VI, Troy VII bore the marks of human violence. Could this be the city of Priam, Hector, and Paris? Many scholars think so. The timeline fits the traditional dating of the Trojan War, and the destruction suggests a violent end. Still, the ruins alone cannot tell us whether this was truly the conflict sung by Homer, or simply one of many wars fought in the turbulent late Bronze Age. The mystery deepens when we compare Homer's vivid descriptions to what the soil has revealed. The Iliad speaks of walls as high as the heavens, and though the fortifications of Troy VI and VII were formidable, they were not the colossal structures of legend. Likewise, the treasures found at Hisarlik, while impressive, did not quite match the wealth of Priam's golden halls, and yet the parallels are too striking to ignore. A thriving Bronze Age city, heavily fortified, destroyed by fire and violence around the very time Greek tradition placed the Trojan War. The evidence suggests that Troy was no mere myth, but what exactly happened here is still open to interpretation. Next, we must weigh Homer's poetry against the hard data of archaeology to see where myth ends and history begins. Standing at the crossroads of myth and history, we are faced with a puzzle. How much of Homer's tale is grounded in reality, and how much is a product of imagination? Archaeology offers pieces, but not the whole picture. Let us hold the fragments of evidence against the verses of the Iliad. First, the cause of the war. Homer immortalized it as the abduction of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. But historians suggest a different motive: control of trade routes. Troy's position near the Dardanelles was strategic. Whoever held the city could dominate the passage between the Aegean and the Black Sea. To Bronze Age kingdoms, this was not a matter of romance, but of survival and power. A war fought for trade and territory may have been remembered, generations later, as a war fought for love. Second, the scale of the conflict. The Iliad speaks of a 10-year siege, with vast armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Archaeological evidence, however, points to a smaller, though still significant, confrontation. Troy VII may have been destroyed in a brief but intense conflict, its people slaughtered or enslaved, its walls breached by fire. Oral tradition, passed down over centuries, could easily magnify a local war into a clash of civilizations. Third, the Trojan Horse. One of the most famous images of Western culture, it does not appear in the Iliad at all, but in later epics like the Aeneid. Could it have been real? Some scholars suggest it was a poetic metaphor for a siege engine or battering ram. Others believe it symbolized an earthquake that broke the walls of Troy. In either case, the story of the horse may be an allegory, not a fact. And yet, the match between Homer's descriptions and the ruins is uncanny. A city with towering walls, a violent destruction around 1200 BCE, a region embroiled in the political rivalries of the late Bronze Age. The legend and the archaeology mirror each other, even if they do not perfectly align. The tentative conclusion: there may have been a war at Troy, rooted in economic and political struggles, later transformed into an epic tale of gods, heroes, and destiny. Certainty is low, but the overlap between story and stone is too great to dismiss. Still, the debate rages on. Some scholars insist Homer was preserving faint memories of a real event. Others argue he crafted a timeless story from fragments of myth and cultural memory. To resolve this, we must look at the wider world of the late Bronze Age and listen to voices beyond Homer's poetry. The ruins at Hisarlik may offer tantalizing clues, but they do not settle the question. Instead, they have fueled one of the most enduring debates in archaeology and history. Was Troy a real city destroyed in war, or is it the ghost of a legend? On one side stand the believers, scholars who argue that Homer preserved echoes of a real conflict. They point to Troy VII's destruction around 1200 BCE as the strongest candidate for the Homeric War. They highlight Hittite records from the same period, which mention a city called Wilusa, a name strikingly similar to Ilios, another term for Troy. These texts describe conflicts between the Hittites and a Western power they called Archaeology, possibly the Achaeans of Greek tradition. To these historians, the puzzle pieces fit: a real city, a real war, later transformed into poetry. On the other side are the skeptics. They caution that archaeology has yet to reveal any inscriptions at Hisarlik naming Troy, Priam, or the heroes of Homer. The Iliad itself was written centuries after the supposed war, and oral traditions are prone to exaggeration, invention, and distortion. To skeptics, Troy VII's destruction was simply one among many during the chaotic collapse of the Bronze Age, a period when cities across the eastern Mediterranean fell to invaders, earthquakes, and famine. In their view, Homer stitched together fragments of memory and myth into a tale that was never meant to be taken as literal history. Adding to the complexity are the moderates, who see truth in both positions. Perhaps there was indeed a conflict at Troy, sparked by trade and power struggles, but it was smaller and more localized than Homer's epic suggests. Over centuries, oral poets expanded it, elevating warriors into demigods, conflicts into world-shaking wars, and a local city into the stage of human destiny. Today, modern science continues to probe the mystery. Archaeologists analyze DNA from human remains at Hisarlik, searching for signs of population shifts or violent death. Digital reconstructions allow us to imagine how Troy's walls once stood against the horizon. And each discovery sparks new questions. Were the bones of warriors found in the rubble the defenders of Priam's city, or victims of an unrelated disaster? Was Wilusa truly Troy, or simply another Anatolian city caught in the crossfire of empires? The debate remains unsettled, and perhaps it always will. But whether believers or skeptics, all agree on one point. The story of Troy has shaped human imagination for millennia, and that impact, in some ways, may matter more than whether the war truly happened. From here, the question shifts from a fact to meaning. What does the legacy of Troy, real or imagined, tell us about ourselves, our past, and the stories we choose to preserve? Whether Troy was a flesh and blood city or merely a creation of myth, its legacy is undeniable. For over 2.5 millennia, the name Troy has carried weight far beyond the ruins at Hisarlik. It has shaped literature, inspired politics, and become a symbol of the blurred boundary between history and imagination. In literature, Troy stands as the cradle of Western storytelling. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey laid the foundation for epic poetry, influencing writers from Virgil and Dante to Shakespeare and beyond. The fall of Troy became the starting point for Rome's own myth of origins. Aeneas, the Trojan hero, was said to have founded the line that led to Rome itself. Without Troy, much of Western cultural identity might have been different. Politically, Troy's legacy has been just as powerful. In the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann's discovery of the city fueled European nationalism, with Greeks and Turks both claiming connections to the legendary past. The ruins became symbols of heritage and pride, used to anchor modern nations in the grandeur of antiquity. Even today, the site at Hisarlik is a UNESCO World Heritage location, drawing visitors who come not only for archaeology, but also for the aura of legend. Philosophically, Troy forces us to confront the role of myth in history. Myths are not merely stories, they are ways in which societies make sense of themselves, encoding values, fears, and aspirations. Whether or not a Trojan War truly happened, the tale of Troy speaks to universal human themes: love and betrayal, honor and vengeance, the fragility of life, and the cost of glory. Its endurance shows how myth can outlast stone, becoming a cultural truth even when historical truth remains uncertain. And yet, the possibility that Troy was real adds an intoxicating dimension. If archaeologists can link Homer's verses to actual ruins, then myth and history are not opposites, but companions. It means that behind every legend may lie a kernel of truth, waiting to be uncovered. It also suggests that the stories we tell today could one day become the myths of the future, distorted, magnified, but still rooted in reality. Troy's significance, then, is twofold: as a legend that has shaped civilizations, and as a historical mystery that reminds us how fragile and elusive the past can be. And this brings us to the final question: what do we in the present make of Troy's uncertain legacy? So, after centuries of poetry, excavation, and debate, where does that leave us? Was Troy a real city that once stood proud on the Anatolian coast, brought to ruin by war and fire? Or was it born entirely in the imagination of poets, a stage for timeless human struggles rather than a record of actual events? The evidence points in many directions. Archaeology shows us a city at Hisarlik that thrived and fell around the very time Greek tradition placed the Trojan War. Ancient Hittite Records whisper of conflicts in a city called Wilusa, which may or may not have been Troy. Homer's verses, though written centuries later, paint such vivid pictures that they almost feel like memories. And yet, no inscription, no unbroken chain of evidence can prove beyond doubt that the Troy of legend was the Troy of history. Perhaps the truth lies in between. Maybe there was a real city, real battles, real suffering, and over time, the poets magnified them into an epic that would echo for millennia. If so, Troy becomes not just a city, but a mirror of humanity itself, where love and war, fact and fiction, history and myth all intertwine. And now the question turns to you. Do you believe in a historical Troy, standing tall until it was torn down in a clash of empires? Or do you see Troy as the eternal creation of Homer's genius, a myth that lives not in ruins but in the imagination? Whichever side you lean toward, one truth remains. The story of Troy has shaped the way we think about the past and about ourselves. And its mystery, unresolved, invites each generation to search for its own answer. If this journey through legend and archaeology has sparked your curiosity, share your thoughts below. Do you side with the believers, the skeptics, or the cautious in between? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more explorations into the mysteries of ancient civilizations, where the line between history and myth is never as clear as it seems.